It is time to check in with CJAD's legal analyst. That is Chris Dimakos. And Chris, we're going to talk today about a story that's very much in the news, and that's a situation that we think all found out about this morning, apparently including people who worked for Amazon. And that is the fact that Amazon's going to be basically shutting down in Quebec. So this is going to affect, we understand, about at least 1,700 workers. Question is, can you just go ahead and do that? What happens to the people working there? Unions, what's next here?
Yeah, so just to give some context, what happened was there was an application to certify a union within the Laval warehouse of Amazon, and they got certified. And the next step was by January, right now, they're supposed to come to an agreement. So the employer, Amazon, and the union, and the people representing the union were supposed to come to some sort of contractual agreement, the collective bargaining agreement, that would basically be the governing rule between both parties. And Amazon answers by saying, we're shutting the whole thing down in Quebec. Now, they've come out and said publicly with their lawyers that it's not in response to what happened with the union certification, but it's the only province where this is happening. And it's right in line with when they had to come to some sort of agreement before the companies would strike. So it's almost as if not only is this an answer to the Quebec attempt to certify, but I think what Amazon's doing here is they're trying to send a message not only to the rest of the provinces in Canada that if you try to go this way, we're not going to do business in your province. So it's unfortunate. Many people have lost their jobs because of this, but there's a debate now as to whether or not unions are being able to achieve what they used to be able to do 50 years ago. It's a little bit different. Landscape of employment's different. Job conditions, it's not so much people are afraid for their safety anymore. It's developed a lot since then. There's been a lot of laws that protect employees. So the actual, the raison d'etre of unions has come into question more often than not. And this is another example of people starting to question whether or not they want a union where they work.
So, the Amazon union issue, I try to remember going back a few years. I think this first happened at a plant in the U.S., in northern New York or somewhere, which became the first, I think, to decide to do this. Do you know, how have these things gone along the way? Because you mentioned Quebec is kind of setting the example for the rest of Canada here. There are other unionized shops, though, in Amazon.
There are. I think what's happening, especially with the Quebec, it's a huge... in terms of the market, we're talking about 1,900 jobs, so it's significant. There's no question about it. And I also think the climate here in Quebec, when you look at not only it's in questions of salary increases, but there's a lot of additional requirements for employers, especially those that come from outside of Quebec, that they have to comply with in Quebec. And sometimes when you start adding and compiling all these different obligations, so-called red tape, sometimes the company says, you know what, maybe it wasn't the best decision to go in there, and they're doing what they do here. Now, I'm not saying that what Amazon is doing is right, but there's no question that Quebec, being the one that's suffering these 1,900 job loss, you have to look at the whole situation in Quebec and why it happened here and not, for example, somewhere else.
Okay, so I hate to kind of phrase it this way. Are we looking here, because you mentioned, I think it's important for people to remember, union certification here was granted. So right. As you just said, the idea being, okay, yes, you could form a union. Now we sit and negotiate. It seems almost like Amazon had planned this all along.
Right, and I think that the lawyers, when that happened, they had a meeting. They took a decision as to what they're going to do. But, other companies like Walmart, this has happened before in Quebec, but what has happened is a store has closed down, and then the union doesn't go away. You can have that union if the jobs are being transferred to another store. Well, then the union would get transferred to another store. And what Amazon did here was they basically said, we're going to wipe out all of the warehouses in Quebec, and what that does is basically it. And they even offered a package to employees to basically tell them, hey, we're giving you this on top of us shutting down your doors, so to dissuade them from trying to keep this from going on. But I think the message for everyone here is, the way the law is set up, and this is what I'm concerned with. The way it's set up, it was set up in a way that was effective 50 years ago. The way they get certified and the obligations of how employers have to deal with employees. And I think if we want to have unions as part of the equation going forward, we have to look at how these unions are formed and how much power they have and what they can and cannot negotiate, because it's not the first and it won't be the last time that a big company like Amazon is going to decide to leave Quebec just because of that.
I guess the only other question I have is with respect to, and we know the Premier speaking on this today, he's going to have to address this. Is there anything a government can do or not?
They can. They can do it, but you can never force a company, a privately owned company, to do business in your province. Right. You can offer incentives, but what happens is when government imposes additional requirements, like the so-called red tape, whether it be language, whether it be taxes, whether it be all the different requirements when you hire and when you interview, when it crosses that threshold of what the company is willing to do and willing not to do. Just a quick reference: I have a client who came to see me who wanted to invest in a franchise, one of the fastest growing franchises in the U.S. and in Canada. And we spoke to the legal team at that franchise, and they said we don't want to go into Quebec. We're not prepared now to change all of our signage, all of our language, all of our contracts. Right. They just weren't ready. They said we might do it in the future, but it's not on the cards right now. So there's a lot that goes into a company coming into Quebec, a lot of additional costs that they might not have to go through in other jurisdictions.
Sure, but in the case of Amazon, I mean, specifically, they didn't just get here. They've been here for several years, so they went through this at the outset. I can't imagine that would have had anything to do with them leaving, or maybe it did. I mean, we don't know.
Well, I don't think that was the reason why they left. I do think, though, that the coincidence is just too far-fetched. I think that the fact that they shut this down when they were supposed to come to an agreement in January, after they spent a lot of money on buildings and infrastructure and training. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars that they invested in Quebec, only to shut it down. For me, it's a direct correlation to the fact that they believe if the unions start developing and flourishing in Quebec, it's going to mean that they're going to lose a lot of their profit margins, and they just don't want to go there.
Last question. With respect to those people, the 1,700 full-time and a couple of hundred part-time who are losing their jobs, what can they do in terms of collecting some kind of benefits? Unemployment insurance is at the end of it?
Right. So they are entitled to employment insurance because they've lost their jobs through no fault of their own. They also are offered a package, I believe, from what I read to the lawyer statements, that Amazon's offering incentives. But once those incentives get used up, they can fall onto employment insurance after that.
Okay. So you can't really, as someone who lost their job, if you choose not to accept whatever is being offered to you, I guess it doesn't make sense or much sense to go ahead and fight it and try to take it to court.
You could. You'd have to look at where the chips are going to fall following. So what presence will Amazon have in Quebec? They talked about using third party,
right?
But you want to look at what presence they do have in Quebec and determine whether or not it's worth it to seek. If you refuse that package, what can you go and get afterwards?
Okay, Chris, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron.